And it doesn't matter who you are, what color you are, anything, right? It's the tendency for us, just as human beings, is we like people who look like us, okay? And who have similar values and cultures and things like that. We can relate to them, okay? This is the JKD process, where not only do we study Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do, both in person and online, but more importantly, we apply Jeet Kune Do philosophy to our lives in order to expose our own limiting beliefs and to live a more authentic life, because that is what Jeet Kune Do really truly is all about, is how can we live as our true self, okay? I'm your coach, Sifu Rob. And in today's video, we're going to talk about a really heavy topic, okay? We do not shy away from the most controversial topics, because a lot of times the topics we don't talk about really affect, those are our limiting beliefs, right? The ones we don't want to talk about, the ones we don't want to deal with. So today we're going to talk about racism. What is racism? And, am I a racist? Are we racist? Let's talk about it. Let's unpack this Pandora's box. Okay, guys, the reason we're talking about racism is because this is such an important topic. I realize it's a highly sensitive topic. It's very politicized nowadays, and I totally understand. I totally get it. However, from a Jeet Kune Do perspective, it's very important that we understand this concept, okay? And the reason I say this is because this affects most of our lives, whether we realize it or not, okay? It certainly affected Bruce Lee's life, right? In his lifetime, right? His entire life experience, for the most part, was based around the fact that he was a Chinese American, right? And so, he experienced that, right? He experienced racism on both sides, right? He experienced racism both in Hong Kong and in China, and as well as here in the States, right? So for those of you guys who may not know, who may not be familiar, right? Bruce Lee was not, quote unquote, pure Chinese, right? So he had German in him, right? He had some German blood in him, right? And so a lot of times, in terms of his upbringing in Wing Chun Kung Fu, a lot of times students looked down on him, right? They didn't treat him necessarily the same way. They looked, it was kind of shamed upon in terms of having Ip Man to instruct him and teach him. So a lot of times Bruce Lee was oftentimes working with other students, right, in terms of his development in Wing Chun. So it was different, right, during that day and time, okay? And so it was very much more closed, right? And they didn't want foreigners in and this kind of thing in Hong Kong. And the fact Bruce Lee wasn't pure Chinese, quote unquote, whatever that means, right? He was discriminated against in Hong Kong in his Wing Chun training. And then he comes to the States, right? And what happens? He gets discriminated here in the States, right? Because why? He's too Chinese here, right? So in Hong Kong, he's not Chinese enough, but then in the States, he's too Chinese, okay? And so he experienced that, right? So he had a difficult time getting roles in films and movies and TV series, right? And so, the famous Kung Fu TV series, which, David Carradine, rest in peace, he ended up getting cast in that role, right? But that was kind of Bruce Lee's idea, right? That was his role that he was supposed to be in. But at the time, Bruce Lee was too Chinese, considered too Chinese in American society. And so it was very difficult for him to get that role. So that was something that he experienced, okay? And a lot of us, we think, well, gosh, Rob, that was, 1960s, we've obviously come a long way since then. And certainly we have, right? However, I think it is a little bit nearsighted for us to assume, right, that we just don't have these tendencies anymore, okay? So what I want to talk about is exactly what is racism, right? Okay, and how do we define it, and how do we understand if we have this within ourselves, okay? And I'll give you the bottom line up front. The answer is we do, okay? Essentially, all of us have some racism in us, okay? And why is that? What do I mean by that? I don't want it to sound as a bad thing. It's like, oh, well, Rob, you're calling me a racist. No, I'm not, okay? What I'm saying is that it is human nature, okay? It is human nature for us to tend to gravitate towards, we tend to like people who we can relate to, right? It's very natural. We like and can relate to and tend to be friends with people who are similar to us, right? Who come from a similar background, similar culture, obviously speak the same language, have similar interests and things along those lines, okay? That is just human nature, okay? It just happens to be that those who are most like us tend to be of our same, skin tone, tend to be of our same race, right? And so that's just how it is. And also just where we grew up geographically, right? And so a lot of times we grew up geographically in areas where there's a predominant a racial group, right? Or mix, right? And so we tend to gravitate to people who are just like us. And a lot of it's based off our upbringing, okay? The problem is, okay, again, that's human nature, okay? The problem is that most of us are just not aware of it, okay? And it doesn't matter who you are, what color you are, anything, right? It's the tendency for us just as human beings is we like people who look like us, okay? And who have similar values and cultures and things like that. We can relate to them, okay? So what does that look like in society, okay? It looks like us, we're going to hire this person, right? we may give this person special benefits or favor or treatment. We may treat them differently, okay? And we may not be conscious of it. And oftentimes we're not, okay? And that's kind of the problem, right? I remember, and most of you guys were probably around and kind of remember, the big Black Lives Matter movement, with the murder of George Floyd. And it was a time of reflection. And I remember just everyone coming out of the woodworks talking about, hey, I did some self-reflection and I have unconscious bias. And, even like the pastor at my church, who's a white guy, but he was like, oh, I have this unconscious bias. And I was like, okay, well, this is really neat. Everyone's kind of, doing some self-examination, which that's what we're trying to do with JKD Process, right? We're trying to peel back that onion within ourselves, right? And discover what happens to be there, whatever that is, right? We're not here to tell people what they're going to discover, but they have to figure out for themselves. But I just remember that time of self-reflection, right? Across the country. And many of us remember that time, okay? But what happens, right? It kind of, fades away, okay? We kind of forget. But we are still the same person that we discovered back during that time, okay? And so what do we do with those lessons that we learned back then, okay? A lot of us have kind of forgotten those, right? So my point is we still need to self-reflect and figure out, hey, how am I, treating people differently, okay? Again, doesn't matter what color you are. Doesn't matter. It's human nature. We all do it, okay? We all tend to relate to people who look, think, come from a similar background just like us, okay? Now, I do want to talk about it on a personal level for myself, okay? As a black man, okay? If you haven't noticed, okay, I'm a black guy, all right? Okay, so, obviously growing up here in America, African-American background. And so, for us, right, that experience is very unique, I think, and very different, in the sense that you kind of grow up in a sense of being a minority, but you're not an immigrant, right? You didn't move here. Your family wasn't, your family didn't immigrate here from a different, country or something like that. So you kind of grow up as an American citizen. You grow up here in the country. However, it's still a little different, right? It's still a little different, okay? One of our famous civil rights activists, James Baldwin, has a famous quote, and this is just his kind of perspective. During his lifetime, he said that to be African American is to be African without memory and American without privilege. And I was like, wow, when I first heard that, I was like, that's, it got me thinking, like, that's pretty profound in a lot of ways, because particularly during his time, right? Because you did have, gross discrimination going on, right? In the 60s and 70s and things like that. So, during that time, during the civil rights era, absolutely, right? There was, it was horrible, right? Okay. I think we can all agree on that, right? And so we've certainly come a long way. I think from my own personal experience, it is harder now, I think, because during the 60s and 70s, and the reason, right, we need to have this discussion, and the reason I'm making this video today is because it has become harder for us to identify racism, both within ourselves internally and also within society, okay? And so we have to do that self-examination, and I think it's very important because it does affect your life regardless of your color, regardless of who you are. That's just what it is. And so I think what has happened now is that it's more covert, right? It's hard to see it, okay? But 6 and 7 is very overt, right? You see civil rights protests, they're getting blasted by fire hoses, they're getting dogs sicked on them, right? They're getting shot and beaten, and all sorts of horrible things are happening, right? And so you can see it. It's very visual. You can very much see the physical racism, and now it's much harder to physically see it, okay? But myself, have certainly experienced it, and it's very strange, okay, in terms of if you are a Black American or any kind of minority, or even if you're not a minority, you can still experience discrimination, okay? People think that I'm just, talking about people of color, but no, okay? It doesn't matter. Again, it does not matter your color, who you are, okay? All of us can experience discrimination, right? And so my point being is that, I've certainly experienced it, but it's weird feeling because you're not sure if it's racism or not, right? Because you're not getting beaten at, right? You're not being called the N-word. You're not, no one's overtly saying it's because of your skin color. But you see the difference in treatment, okay? And for me, it was an experience at the workplace. It was an experience on my job, right? Because in case you guys don't know, I don't teach martial arts full time, okay? I joke and I tell people, hey, if you want to make money, don't open a martial arts school, okay? Okay, it's a struggle, okay? That's just the reality of it. But we're doing okay. Don't worry, we're doing fine. But it is a challenge. But anyway. My point is that, that's where I experienced it, was on the job, on the workplace. I saw the difference in treatment, okay? I saw how folks, got promoted, right? They got promoted a little bit differently. They got favored more when it comes to meetings and you have to present or you have to brief, the kind of questions that are asked, the kind of trust that is placed on some people versus others. And then you get more questions depending on who you are, your background, and whether you're favored or liked. And there was certainly a difference in discrimination in how people are treated, okay? That is what it is, okay? And again, it's human nature. It's okay. We're not perfect, okay? Right? We're not perfect, okay? But we need to be more conscious of kind of how our tendencies happen to be, okay? Just so we can monitor that, right? So I personally have experienced that. I've seen it. I've had friends experience it where, one person, made a mistake, right? Makes a mistake on the job, gets fired, okay? Same guy, different race, different ethnicity, makes that same mistake. Nothing happens to him. He gets promoted. He's doing well in his career, okay? The other guy's struggling, okay? And there have been many examples of this, okay? And so that's why I want to have this conversation, because it has been on my mind, okay? Now, bringing it back to Bruce Lee, okay? Chinese American, right? Chinese American. If you've seen any of his films, okay, what's the theme in so many of his films? Okay, he tends to be the Chinese American, or really the Chinaman, right? He tends to be the China guy, right? Who's going to a new place, right? Whether it's, Italy, as in Way of the Dragon or Return of the Dragon, okay? Or he's going to Han's Island, okay? Or in The Big Boss, or also, called Fist of Fury, he was still going to a new area, right? But he tends to be play the foreigner, right? The Chinese guy who's coming in, okay? And what happens in his films, there's racism, right? It's very overt, right? So in Way of the Dragon, you see it all the time with the Italians, right? And they're discriminating against the Chinese, and he had to fight that, right? He's fighting racism. And so in his films, there's always this kind of undertone, right? And in the Chinese Connection, which released here is Chinese Connection, but also known as Fist of Fury as well. But in that one, right, there was racism, coming from the Japanese, okay? And so my point is, okay, no matter who you are, many of us, many cultures throughout history have experienced racism, okay? From my perspective, we can only talk about it from the terms of our own lens, right? As a Black man, I can speak to it from my perspective. You have to figure out what works for you and how you can relate to that, okay? And whether that's happened to you, or maybe you've been you discriminate against someone else, right? Unintentionally, or just not known, okay? And that's understandable. You're a human. We make mistakes, okay? But I want to point that out, okay? Now, from my perspective, again, because that's the only perspective I can really speak from, okay? As a Black man, and I hope this gives you guys a little bit of insight into, Black America to some degree, okay? Just my experience, right? We are in a unique position, I think, among the peoples of the world, because I am not aware of any other place where an entire continent was colonized and enslaved, right? I think all of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, was effectively colonized by Europe, and millions, I believe millions, maybe billions, but I know a lot of people, okay? A lot of my ancestors were enslaved and taken all over the globe, right? And so we are some of the only people, who don't speak their native language, right? So obviously our language has changed. I'm speaking English to you right now, right? English obviously is not a native language to Africa, right? So when we talk about language, when we talk about culture, right? In terms of our music, our food, right? Our mannerisms, our religion, right? All these things, for the African Americans, all these things have been lost, okay? So a lot of people, they look at, Black America and they say, man, Black America is broken. Black America has all these problems, and certainly there's challenges. Certainly there's issues. Okay. But I think it's important to understand certainly the historical context, because these things don't just go away, right? When you take a people and you disconnect them from their identity, right? You disconnect them from who they are. Okay. And that's really what brought me to Jeet Kune Do, right? Was this idea of being yourself, being who you are, and reconnecting to your identity. For me, it's important for me to understand that aspect of myself as a Black man, okay? But for you, it may be something different. It may be something else that you may have repressed, something in your family history, your own background, right? That or trauma, right? That you may have, that has shaped you in some way, but you may have kind of put in the back of your mind and not want to think about, or have just not thought about for whatever reason, okay? But in my case, being disconnected from that identity, it was a struggle, right? Because you're American, right? We're Black Americans, we are truly American, but, we call ourselves African American, right? We're all just American, right? Aren't we all just American? Okay, so it's a strange dichotomy in that sense, and we as a people are trying to reshape that identity, right? We're trying to figure out who we are, because you think about it, the culture we have in terms of Black American culture, a lot of this is Black American culture we've had to kind of figure out and bring up through slavery, right? Because when you hear about Black history, okay, let's talk about that for a minute, right? When you hear about Black history, history is also a part of your identity. It's part of who you are, where you come from, right? Our history is tied to what? When you celebrate Black History Month in February, or you at least hear about it, right? You may not celebrate it, but maybe you get a day off or something, and you hear about it on TV, or there's different movies playing and themes around your town. But what we know about Black history are two things, right? We really know we were slaves, and we fought for civil rights. Like that, those are our heroes, okay, right? So every year for Black History Month, we learn about the fact that we were enslaved and that we struggled for civil rights. That is our story every year that we're being told. That is our identity, right? So what do you think that does, right? What do you think that does to a people, 50 years or 60 years after the civil rights movement, right? We still have that identity, right? It doesn't change, right? It doesn't change, because until that story changes, right? That will be our same identity. And so what is important for Black America, again, this is just Rob's opinion, okay? And again, you have to apply it to yourself. I realize most of my audience is not Black, but the idea, I want you to take my own examination of myself as a Black man and apply it to yourself, apply it to your life and your situation. This is stuff I've had to wrestle with and uncover within myself, because there is this trauma, there's this pain, and I didn't know what it was, okay? I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to identify it. I saw I was treated a little bit differently, but I didn't know why. I didn't know what it was, or what caused it, or how to identify with it. I also understood that I really didn't identify with a lot of American culture, and I didn't see myself in that culture. And so it's like, where do you find yourself? Okay. So that's significant, right? But getting back to that, it's important for us in Black America to understand our history extends, beyond slavery and civil rights, right? When we talk about Black history, the idea is that Black history did not start with slavery, right? There were Black people on Earth And there were black people in America before slavery, right? But we don't talk about that. Most of us don't even know that, right? We don't celebrate that, right? But what happens now to a society? What happens to a people when you change the narrative, right? If you want to change the world, change the narrative, right? And it's a true narrative, right? It's not like you're making a story up, okay? But change the stories that we tell each other, right? So we're telling ourselves and we're telling our people that you guys, you know, your history started with slavery, right? Your history started with you being slaves and beaten and in servitude, right? And then you got your civil rights and now you're free, right? You still have that same identity. But again, going back to the legacy of Black history before slavery, right? The history of Africa, right? To the legacy, the greatness of the kingdoms and the people and the culture and reconnecting, right? Because that's the identity that's lost. You know, as Black Americans, we have no connection to that identity, right? And this has been for me a process of intense self-discovery and intense questioning of myself, right? And I hope you guys do that same kind of questioning. It may not be related to race, but it may be related to something else, okay? But most other people have some connection back to their land, right? Whether you're Chinese, you're Japanese, you're Indian, you're European, you're Russian, whatever, wherever you come from, right? Your people come from, you have some connection, generally speaking. Most people seem to have a connection to some homeland, right? That they can consider their homeland, okay? But, you know, again, Black America and many, we call it the diaspora, right? The kind of spreading out of African people. Many of us don't have that same connection to Africa or to where our ancestors come from. So, but that's a big part of who we are and shaped who we are. So if we never connect to that, if we never connect back to that source, back to that part of ourselves, back to that identity, you know, of course there's going to be dysfunction, right? Of course, okay, right? So, you know, when we talk about, there's a big political discussion about reparations, but when we talk about something like that, we're talking about making repairs. We're talking about repairing the damage, you know, that has been done. But that's also something that we have to do internally, right? So you as a human being, you have to do your own repairing of yourself and reconnecting to the things that have been lost, that lost piece of yourself, right? That you need to connect with and identify with. The difficult part is that you oftentimes don't know what that is because you don't know what you don't know. And so it does take a lot of reflection, a lot of time, and sometimes trauma to kind of unveil and uncover what it is, that rock that is kind of preventing us from moving forward. So, all right, guys, okay. Like I say, heavy topic, heavy topic, but I wanted to present that to you guys. Again, it's not about color. It doesn't matter what color you are, okay? Again, we all have this kind of tendency to like people who are like us and similar to us, okay? The opposite is also true, right? Just because you are of a particular race doesn't mean you can't discriminate against those who are of your own race as well, right? Because that also is something that is a real reality, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind, okay? It's not black and white, right? Okay, any of us can be victims of discrimination and racism, and any of us can be perpetrators of discrimination and racism against those outside of our race and against those within our own race as well. Okay, so, you know, think about it in those terms. Try to do some self-discovery. You know, not just on the topic of race and racism, certainly be aware of that within yourself and kind of be cognizant of that. And it's more than just, a lot of people say, well, I don't see skin color, I don't see race, okay? And that's, to me, a very blind way of thinking, okay? You literally don't see, okay? But you need to see color. You need to see race because you need to see that individual, because their race, their culture, their color has shaped to a large extent the kind of person that they are, right? I think if Bruce Lee wasn't Chinese, right, he would have had a different life, a different experience, right? But his Chinese background and being mixed Chinese and German and then being born in the States, that affected his life, that affected his perspective on everything, right? And so I think it's certainly short-sighted, if not blind, to think that we don't see color and that it doesn't matter, because it absolutely matters. It absolutely shapes the person you are today. And that's okay, right? That is okay. But do that self-examination work, do that self-study, and see what you discover and see how you can now transform that in order to live as your authentic self, okay? To truly be the person that you were made to be, you were designed to be, okay? To live the most fulfilling life possible, okay? And find that sense of purpose, all right? Again, I'm your coach, guys, Sifu Rob. This has been another video here on JKD Process. We'll see you guys in the next video.